Dawn broke over the coast of Normandy on June 8, 1944. Oberst Wilhelm Richter of the 716 Infantry Division stood frozen on the cliffs near Arromanches, his binoculars trained on the horizon. What had been empty sea just 24 hours earlier now hosted an impossible sight, an entire artificial harbor materializing from the morning mist. Massive concrete caissons, larger than 5-story buildings, formed breakwaters. Steel roadways extended from the shore to floating piers, landing craft and supply ships already docked at what appeared to be a fully functional port. "Mein Gott," Richter whispered to his intelligence officer, Hauptmann Franz Weber. "They've brought their harbors with them." The floating harbors, codenamed Mulberry by the Allies, represented engineering on a scale that defied Richter's comprehension. In his 7 years of military service, including campaigns across Poland, France, and Russia, he had never witnessed anything like this. What he saw defied 15 years of Nazi propaganda about Allied industrial inferiority and German technological supremacy. "This cannot be real," Weber muttered, taking the binoculars. "They must be inflatable decoys." But as the morning progressed, the truth became undeniable. The Allies hadn't just staged the largest amphibious landing in military history 2 days earlier. They had solved the seemingly insurmountable problem of supplying that invasion by creating artificial harbors in a matter of hours. The structures they were witnessing represented industrial capacity and logistical planning that German High Command had repeatedly assured them the democracies could never achieve. What Richter and Weber witnessed that morning would fundamentally alter their understanding of the war and their enemy. The floating harbors represented more than just an engineering marvel. They were physical proof that everything the Third Reich had told them about Western capabilities was a catastrophic lie. And as the enormity of this deception dawned on the German defenders, the psychological impact would prove as devastating as the military consequences. The story of how artificial harbors broke German morale begins long before D-Day. Since Adolf Hitler's rise to power in 1933, Nazi propaganda had systematically cultivated a narrative of German exceptionalism and Allied inferiority. Reich Minister Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine portrayed the Americans as soft consumers incapable of real sacrifice, the British as a fading empire desperately clinging to past glories, and their combined industrial capacity as fundamentally inferior to German ingenuity and discipline. This carefully constructed worldview permeated German military thinking. By 1944, most Wehrmacht officers genuinely believed their forces possessed qualitative advantages that would overcome Allied numerical superiority. The propaganda was particularly effective regarding America, portraying the United States as a nation of assembly line workers who could produce quantity but never quality, a country that built refrigerators and automobiles, not sophisticated weapons of war. General Major Rudolf Hoffmann, who served in the German High Command's Intelligence Division, later recalled, "We were told repeatedly that American mass production meant inferior design, that their ships would break apart in Atlantic storms, their aircraft engines would fail, their tanks would be death traps. We believed because we needed to believe." This conviction extended to logistical capabilities. German military doctrine recognized harbor facilities as critical vulnerabilities. When planning the Atlantic Wall defenses, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had specifically targeted port facilities for extensive demolition preparations. "If we can deny them ports, we can deny them supply," Rommel declared in a January 1944 planning session. "No army can fight without supply, and no supply can reach them without harbors." The German strategy for defeating any cross-channel invasion rested heavily on this assumption. By destroying all port facilities along the French coast, which they did with ruthless efficiency, they believed they could starve any landing force before reinforcements arrived. It was a sound strategy based on all previous military operations. General Erich Marx, responsible for coastal defenses in Normandy, confidently stated in April 1944, the Americans require 7 pounds of supply per man per day. Without a functioning port, they will be reduced to eating sand within a week. What Marx and the entire German High Command failed to anticipate was the Allied willingness to innovate beyond conventional military thinking. While German engineers focused on building impregnable concrete bunkers and sophisticated weaponry, British planners had been quietly developing the seemingly impossible prefabricated floating harbors that could be towed across the English Channel and assembled off any beach. Winston Churchill himself had set this project in motion with a simple memo dated May 30th, 1942. Piers for use on beaches. They must float up and down with the tide. The anchor problem must be mastered. Let me have the best solution worked out. Don't argue the matter. The difficulties will argue for themselves. Over the next 2 years, in absolute secrecy, British engineers designed and constructed the components for 2 massive artificial harbors, each the size of the port of Dover, the 3rd busiest port in England. The scale of the project was staggering: 203 concrete caissons, some weighing 7,000 tons, 60 miles of floating roadways, 6 miles of breakwater made from old ships deliberately sunk in position. All to be assembled in days, not the months or years required for conventional port construction. While the Germans suspected an invasion was coming, they never imagined their enemy could overcome the harbor problem through such radical innovation. This blind spot was born not just of intelligence failure, but of ideological conviction, a genuine belief that democratic nations lacked the organizational discipline and industrial capacity for such a complex engineering feat. Oberleutnant Klaus Müller of the 352nd Infantry Division captured this mindset in his diary entry from May 15, 1944. Our commanders assure us the British and Americans cannot sustain a landing. They require established ports, and we control all ports. Their supply lines will be their undoing. The contrast between German expectations and the reality that materialized off Normandy's coast could not have been more stark. The sheer scale of Allied industrial might, embodied in these floating harbors, confronted German defenders with irrefutable evidence that the Reich's assessment of their enemies was catastrophically wrong. For Wilhelm Richter, the revelation began that morning of June 8th, but deepened over the following days as he witnessed the harbor's extraordinary capabilities firsthand. Through his observation post near Arromanches, he watched as the artificial port, designated Mulberry Bee by the Allies, transformed from an engineering curiosity into a logistics machine of unprecedented efficiency. By June 10th, barely 48 hours after his initial sighting, Richter observed the port handling supply volumes that matched those of Dover in peacetime. Ships that would normally require specialized docking facilities were efficiently unloading onto floating piers. Trucks and tanks rolled directly from landing craft onto the floating roadways, then onto French soil. The harbor operated around the clock, impervious to tides that would have rendered beach landings impossible. They have conquered the sea itself, Richter wrote in his report to divisional headquarters. The harbor appears to handle 1,500 tons of material per day. At minimum, the implications for our defensive strategy are severe. His intelligence officer, Franz Weber, compiled detailed observations that revealed the true extent of the engineering achievement. The floating breakwaters, massive hollow concrete structures called bombardons, effectively created calm waters even during rough seas. The floating piers rose and fell with the tides, allowing continuous operation regardless of water level. The roadways, designated whales in Allied planning, flexed with the waves while supporting vehicles weighing up to 40 tons. Weber's background in civil engineering before the war gave him a professional appreciation for what he was witnessing. The precision required to make these components in different locations, transport them across the channel, and have them function together seamlessly exceeds anything I believed possible in wartime conditions, he noted in his assessment. What particularly disturbed both men was not just the harbor itself, but what it represented. Every massive concrete caisson, every section of floating roadway, every specialized piece of equipment implied vast industrial resources diverted from other war materiel. The harbors represented excess capacity, the ability to allocate enormous resources to solve a single tactical problem, while still maintaining production of aircraft, tanks, ships, and ammunition. This realization struck at the core of German strategic confidence. Throughout the war, Nazi leadership had assured the military and the public that Germany's focused industrial effort would ultimately overcome the Allies' greater raw production capacity. Quality would defeat quantity. Intensity of purpose would overcome material advantage. The floating harbors demolished this comforting fiction. They demonstrated not just material superiority, but engineering excellence, organizational capability, and strategic foresight that German propaganda had insisted that democracies lacked. For Unteroffizier Heinrich Gerlach, a 23-year-old signal specialist with the 352nd Division, the harbors represented his first direct observation of Allied capabilities. Unlike veteran officers who had fought in Africa or Italy, Gerlach's perception of the enemy came almost exclusively from official information sources. We had been told the Americans were soft, undisciplined, their equipment flashy but unreliable, he later recalled in a 1973 interview. Then we see these massive structures appearing overnight, functioning perfectly in harsh conditions. It was like discovering everything you had been taught was backwards. They were not the ones with shoddy equipment and poor planning. We were. Gerlach's reaction was shared by many along the Atlantic Wall. Lieutenant General Friedrich Dahlmann, commander of the 7th Army defending Normandy, reportedly became physically ill when shown reconnaissance photographs of the Mulberry harbors. The implications for his defensive strategy were catastrophic. His forces had already failed to repel the initial landings. Now, the harbors meant the Allies could build up forces faster than he could contain them. If they can build harbors, they can build anything, Dahlmann told his staff on June 11th. We are not fighting the same enemy we prepared for. The psychological impact extended beyond the command level. Ordinary German soldiers, already shaken by the scale of the initial landings and the overwhelming Allied air superiority, saw in the harbors a tangible symbol of what they were up against. Feldwebel Otto Becker of the 716th Infantry Division recalled the impact on his men's morale. Before the invasion, we joked about the soft Americans and their endless supplies. We called them refrigerator soldiers who wouldn't last a week under fire. After seeing their floating harbors and the endless stream of materiel coming ashore, the jokes stopped. Men began to ask what else we had been told that wasn't true. This questioning proved dangerous to German morale. Once soldiers began doubting official information about Allied capabilities, other certainties became suspect as well. Was final victory really inevitable? Were wonder weapons really coming to turn the tide? Was Germany's position truly as strong as they had been told? For many, the harbors became a catalyst for broader disillusionment. Richter noted a marked change in his officers' discussions after June 10th. There is less talk of victory and more talk of duty, he wrote in a personal letter never sent. The fantasy of Allied incompetence has been washed away with the tide. The harbors revealed more than just industrial capacity. They demonstrated planning depth that contradicted German assessments of Allied leadership. The components had been designed, tested, and manufactured in complete secrecy over 2 years. Thousands of workers had participated without security breaches. Resources had been allocated and coordinated across multiple agencies and military branches. This level of organization directly challenged the Nazi narrative that democracies were chaotic, inefficient systems incapable of sustained, coordinated effort. The harbors were physical proof that the democracies could plan and execute complex operations with discipline and precision traditionally associated with authoritarian regimes. For Hauptmann Weber, whose pre-war academic background gave him a broader perspective than many of his comrades, this realization was particularly profound. We were told their democracies made them weak, unable to focus, prone to division, he wrote in his post-war memoir. The harbors proved the opposite. Their system produced innovation and organizational capability beyond what our rigid hierarchy could achieve. The contrast became even more stark when German officers compared the harbors to their own logistical challenges. By June 1944, German forces in Normandy were already experiencing severe supply problems. Allied air attacks had crippled the transportation network throughout northern France. Simple movements of troops and equipment that should have taken hours required days. Fuel shortages, immobilized vehicles, ammunition was strictly rationed. Against this backdrop of scarcity and constraint, the Allies were creating infrastructure at will. On June 11th, a German reconnaissance flight reported a second harbor, designated Mulberry A by the Allies, operational off Omaha Beach. Two artificial ports, each handling thousands of tons of supplies daily, where previously there had been only open beaches. Oberstleutnant Werner Hoffmann, an artillery commander with the 352nd Division, found the comparison devastating to his confidence. "We cannot move a single battalion without calculating fuel to the liter," he told his staff. "They build harbors like children build sand castles, simply because they can." The evidence of Allied abundance continued to mount. German observers noted that damaged sections of the harbors were quickly replaced, suggesting the Allies had constructed substantial backup components. When rough seas damaged sections of floating roadway, new sections appeared the following day. The redundancy built into the system spoke of resources deployed with almost casual profligacy. This sense of overwhelming material superiority gained tragic validation between June 19th and June 22nd, when one of the most severe channel storms in decades struck the Normandy coast. The storm completely destroyed the American harbor at Omaha Beach and severely damaged the British harbor at Arromanches. German commanders briefly hoped this natural intervention might disrupt the Allied buildup. Their hopes were quickly dashed. Within days, the British had repaired their harbor at Arromanches. Rather than attempt to rebuild the American harbor, the Allies simply accelerated the capture of the port of Cherbourg, which fell on June 26th, despite Hitler's order that it be defended to the last man. Meanwhile, the Americans demonstrated they could supply their forces over open beaches with remarkable efficiency, having developed specialized amphibious vehicles and waterproofed conventional trucks that could drive directly from landing craft through shallow water onto shore. The response to the storm highlighted another advantage German observers found deeply troubling: the Allied capacity for improvisation and adaptation. When circumstances changed, the Allies adjusted their plans without apparent disruption. This flexibility stood in marked contrast to German operations, which increasingly required direct authorization from Hitler himself, creating paralysis in the face of changing battlefield conditions. Lieutenant Paul Müller, a 25-year-old company commander with the 352nd Division, captured this realization in a letter to his brother in July. "They have resources to try multiple solutions to any problem. When one approach fails, they simply try another. We must succeed on the first attempt or fail entirely. This is the difference between fighting with abundance and fighting with scarcity." The harbor's impact extended far beyond their immediate logistical function. For many German soldiers, they became symbols of a fundamental miscalculation about the nature of the war itself. The Reich had committed to a conflict against nations whose industrial capacity vastly exceeded Germany's, believing superior will, discipline, and tactical skill would overcome material disadvantage. The floating harbors demonstrated that the Allies had not just quantitative but qualitative advantages. They could build more, but they could also build better. They could mass produce, but they could also innovate. Most disturbingly, they could accomplish these feats while simultaneously producing fleets of aircraft, endless columns of tanks, mountains of ammunition, and oceans of fuel. By late June, this realization was spreading throughout German forces in Normandy. Gefreiter Johann Schmidt of the 352nd Division Artillery Corps recalled the changing conversations among his fellow soldiers. Before the invasion, we spoke of how many of them we would kill. After seeing their harbors and endless supplies, we spoke of how long we could hold out. It was no longer a question of victory, but of survival. For officers with broader strategic understanding, the implications were even more sobering. Major Karl Weidenmann, operations officer for the 716th Division, had been among those who witnessed the harbors in operation during their first week. In a classified assessment sent to Corps headquarters on June 20th, he wrote, "The floating harbors represent not merely an engineering solution, but a fundamental strategic advantage. They can land anywhere, supply anywhere, attack anywhere. Our entire defensive concept is invalidated." Weidenmann's assessment was prescient. The harbors gave the Allies an operational flexibility that German defenses, stretched thin along thousands of kilometers of coastline, could not counter. If one landing area proved too difficult, the Allies could simply shift their artificial harbors to another location. The psychological effect on German defenders was paralysis. Every beach became a potential invasion point, requiring maximum defensive preparation. The personal testimony of those who witnessed the harbors firsthand reveals the depth of psychological impact. Gefreiter Walter Fischer, a 19-year-old machine gunner with the 716th Division, was captured on June 23rd during fighting near Bayeux. During his initial interrogation, the young soldier surprised his American captors by asking detailed questions about the harbors. How long did it take to build them? How many men worked on the project? How did you keep it secret? Fischer's Allied interrogator recorded these questions, noting the Germans' fascination seemed to exceed normal military curiosity. When asked why he was so interested, Fischer's response was revealing, "Because they are proof of what we are fighting against. If you can build harbors in days, what else can you do that we thought impossible?" For many German soldiers, the harbors created a cognitive crisis. Their understanding of the world, shaped by years of carefully crafted propaganda, collided with irrefutable physical evidence that contradicted everything they had been told. This cognitive dissonance produced reactions ranging from denial to despair, to a complete re-evaluation of their commitment to the Nazi cause. Obergefreiter Hans Müller of the 352nd Division's Reconnaissance Battalion described this transformation in his post-war account. "Seeing those harbors was like being a medieval man who believed the world was flat, suddenly sailing around it. Everything I thought I knew about our enemies, about the war, about our chances, had to be reconsidered. And once you begin questioning one aspect of what you've been told, you cannot stop there." The impact on German strategic thinking was equally profound. As news and images of the harbors spread through intelligence channels, commanders far from Normandy began reassessing Allied capabilities. Reports of the harbors reached as far as Army Group Center on the Eastern Front, where senior officers were stunned by the engineering achievement. General Walter Model, who would later command German forces attempting to repel Operation Market Garden, reportedly told his staff after seeing photographs of the Mulberry harbors, "If they can build floating ports, they can build floating bridges across the Rhine. We must reconsider all our defensive assumptions." The harbors' psychological impact was magnified by their visibility. Unlike aircraft production statistics or tank manufacturing capacity, which remained abstract concepts for most soldiers, the harbors were physical structures that could be seen, measured, and comprehended directly. Their massive scale offered irrefutable proof of Allied industrial might that no amount of propaganda could dismiss. German prisoners captured near the harbors consistently expressed astonishment at what they had witnessed. Allied interrogation reports from June and July 1944 note that German POWs frequently mentioned the harbors without prompting, many describing them as turning points in their understanding of the war's probable outcome. One interrogation report dated July 3, 1944, recorded the reaction of Feldwebel Kurt Schmidt of the 352nd Division. Prisoner appeared visibly shaken when discussing the artificial harbors, stated repeatedly that nothing in his training or briefings had prepared him for such capabilities. When asked about German morale, he replied, "How would your morale be if everything you believed about your enemy proved false in a single day?" The harbor's impact extended beyond military personnel to civilian administration in occupied France. French resistance reports indicate that German civil authorities in Normandy and Brittany became notably more pessimistic after news of the harbor spread. Robert Leblanc, a resistance leader in Caen, noted in his July 5th dispatch, "Local German administrators speak openly of the harbors as proof the tide has turned. They now seek contacts who might vouch for their conduct after liberation." For Wehrmacht officers with engineering backgrounds, the harbors represented a particularly powerful revelation about relative industrial capabilities. Major Heinrich Wagner, an engineering officer with the 352nd Division, had worked for Krupp before the war and understood the manufacturing challenges involved in such massive structures. In a technical assessment prepared for divisional intelligence on June 25th, Wagner calculated that each harbor required approximately 55,000 tons of concrete, 15,000 tons of steel, and hundreds of specialized components. The ability to allocate such resources to a single tactical problem while maintaining full production of conventional war materiel implied industrial capacity far beyond what German intelligence had estimated. The harbors are not merely engineering achievements, Wagner concluded. They represent excess productive capacity that our analyses failed to identify. The strategic implications extend far beyond Normandy. Wagner's assessment proved accurate. By July 1944, the remaining Mulberry Harbor at Arromanches was handling over 9,000 tons of supplies daily, equivalent to a major commercial port in peacetime. The Americans, having lost their harbor to the storm, were nevertheless moving 7,000 tons daily across open beaches using specialized landing craft and amphibious vehicles. The combined supply volume exceeded what German logistical experts had considered theoretically possible without established port facilities. The disparity between German expectations and Allied achievements was captured vividly by Oberleutnant Franz Keller, a logistics officer with the 352nd Division. In his final report before being captured on July 12th, Keller wrote, "We have 5 supply trucks for the entire regiment and fuel for perhaps 3. The Americans have created an entire artificial port simply to make their supply operations more convenient. This is not a difference of degree, but of kind." For German soldiers who had endured years of increasing material shortages, the abundance displayed through the harbors and subsequent supply operations proved psychologically devastating. Many had been sustained by the belief that they were fighting against opponents who, while materially superior, lacked the will and organizational capability to use those advantages effectively. The harbors demolished this comforting fiction. They demonstrated not just material superiority, but organizational excellence, technological innovation, and strategic foresight that German propaganda had insisted the democracies could never achieve. Feldwebel Ernst Hoffmann, captured near Caen on July 9th, expressed this realization during his interrogation. "We were told the Americans were amateurs playing at war, that they understood business, but not combat. The harbors prove they understand both, and at a scale we cannot match. How do you fight an enemy who builds harbors as easily as we build foxholes?" The psychological transformation extended to the highest levels of German command. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B, responsible for defending the invasion coast, personally observed the harbors during a reconnaissance flight on June 17th. His aide, Captain Helmuth Lang, later recalled Rommel's reaction. The field marshal said nothing for several minutes after seeing the harbors. When he finally spoke, he said, "We have lost the war. They can replace everything they lose, and we cannot replace anything." It was the first time I heard him express such certainty about the outcome. Rommel's realization came not just from the harbors themselves, but from what they represented in the broader context of the war. By June 1944, Germany was fighting defensive battles on 3 fronts: in Italy in the east against the Soviet Union, and now in France. Resources were stretched to breaking point. Critical shortages of fuel, ammunition, and replacement equipment affected every theater. Against this backdrop of scarcity, the Allies were demonstrating the capacity to create infrastructure at will. The contrast could not have been more stark or more demoralizing. German forces were rationing artillery shells while the Allies were building harbors simply to make supply operations more efficient. This disparity in resources manifested in countless ways that German soldiers witnessed daily. Allied aircraft flew continuous combat missions, suggesting unlimited fuel supplies. Their artillery fired massive preparatory barrages before each attack, indicating abundant ammunition. Damaged tanks were quickly replaced, sometimes within hours. Even small items like batteries for radios, chronically scarce for German units, appeared unlimited on the Allied side. Lieutenant Karl Weiss, a communications officer with the 716th Division, noted this contrast in his final diary entry before being killed on July 7th. "Our last functioning radio must serve the entire battalion, and we have batteries perhaps for 3 more days. Today we observed an American forward unit with a radio for each squad. They left one behind when it malfunctioned rather than attempt repairs." This tells us everything about the different wars we are fighting. The harbor served as the most visible symbol of this disparity, but German soldiers encountered evidence of overwhelming Allied material superiority at every turn. Hauptmann Franz Miller of the 352nd Division's anti-tank unit recorded his men's reaction to recovering an abandoned American supply dump on June 29th. The men were more demoralized by what they found than by any combat experience. Cartons of cigarettes, chocolate, canned fruit, white bread, items unseen in Germany for years, were stacked in casual abundance. One private began weeping when he found the Americans had used coffee as a ground covering to reduce mud. His family in Hamburg had not tasted real coffee since 1940. This casual waste of items considered precious luxuries in Germany created a profound impression. German soldiers, many of whom received increasingly desperate letters from families at home describing shortages and hardships, found themselves facing an enemy for whom scarcity seemed not to exist. The psychological impact was devastating. Oberstleutnant Wilhelm Meyer, commander of a Panzer Grenadier battalion fighting near Caen, described this effect in his July 4th assessment to regimental headquarters. "The men fight bravely, but with decreasing conviction. They see endless Allied supplies while receiving letters describing food shortages at home. They hear our propaganda claim German technology is superior, then watch Sherman tanks replace losses within hours, while our Panthers sit immobilized for lack of spare parts. The floating harbors merely confirm what they have already witnessed. We are fighting an enemy with resources we cannot match." The harbor's psychological impact was particularly acute for younger soldiers whose entire worldview had been shaped by Nazi education and propaganda. For veterans who remembered Germany before Hitler, alternative perspectives existed. For those who had grown up under the Third Reich, the harbors and what they represented required a complete re-evaluation of everything they had been taught. Gefreiter Johannes Schmidt, a 19-year-old infantryman with the 716th Division, captured this crisis of faith in a letter found on his body after he was killed on July 6th. "I have been taught since childhood that our will and spirit would overcome any material advantage our enemies possessed. Now I see their harbors, their endless tanks, their aircraft darkening the sky, And I question everything. If they can produce such abundance, what does that say about the society that built it? If we are superior, why can we not match them? Schmidt's questioning reveals how the harbors challenged not just military assumptions, but ideological foundations. Nazi propaganda had consistently portrayed the democratic capitalist nations as decadent, divided, and weak. Their material prosperity was dismissed as shallow materialism that would crumble in the face of ideological commitment and military challenge. The floating harbors, with their massive concrete caissons and complex engineering, represented something different: material prosperity harnessed to determined purpose. They demonstrated that the Allies possessed not just things but capabilities, not just consumption but production, not just wealth but the organizational capacity to direct that wealth toward strategic objectives. For soldiers who had been raised on notions of German cultural and racial superiority, this realization proved profoundly disorienting. If Western democracies could produce such engineering marvels while simultaneously building aircraft, tanks, ships, and all the other material of war in seemingly unlimited quantities, how could Germany possibly compete? More troublingly, what did this imply about the regime's fundamental claims regarding German superiority? Feldwebel Heinrich Müller, a 27-year-old veteran of the Russian front reassigned to Normandy in early June, captured this ideological crisis in his journal Recovered after his capture on July 15th. In Russia, we could tell ourselves the Soviets won through endless manpower, willing to absorb casualties we could never accept. The Americans are different. They win through machines, innovation, organization. Their harbors show they can reshape the physical world to suit their military needs. This is not just material superiority, but intellectual achievement. Where does this leave our claims of German genius? The harbor's impact extended beyond the immediate battlefield to influence strategic calculations throughout the German High Command. By late June, as the scope of the Allied logistical achievement became clear, German strategic options narrowed dramatically. Without the ability to strangle Allied supply lines, the central pillar of defensive planning, containing the Normandy bridgehead, became impossible. This realization cascaded through the command chain, leading to increasingly desperate measures. On June 17th, Hitler ordered the deployment of V-1 flying bombs against London, hoping these wonder weapons might diminish British involvement in the Normandy campaign. The psychological effectiveness of these weapons was limited, particularly against a population that had endured the Blitz and now saw tangible evidence of approaching victory. More critically, the revelation of actual Allied capabilities forced a fundamental reassessment of Germany's strategic position. Throughout 1942 and 1943, German planning had been based on the assumption that the Western Allies lacked the capability and will for a major cross-channel invasion. Even after the landings, there remained hope that supply challenges would limit the operation's scale and sustainability. The harbors demolished these assumptions. They demonstrated that the Allies had not only the will for a major campaign, but had spent years developing innovative solutions to anticipated challenges. This foresight and preparation implied a level of commitment that German leadership had consistently underestimated. General Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the German Armed Forces High Command, captured this reassessment in a July 3rd briefing to senior commanders. The artificial harbors represent more than an engineering solution. They demonstrate the Allies have committed their full industrial and intellectual resources to this campaign. They have planned for every contingency we identified and developed counters to every advantage we thought we possessed. This realization affected German operations at every level. Tactically, units began conserving ammunition and fuel, recognizing the increasing disparity between their limited resources and seemingly unlimited Allied supplies. Operationally, commanders became increasingly reluctant to commit to major counteroffensives, understanding they lacked the logistical capacity to sustain extended operations against an enemy with secure and abundant supply lines. Strategically, the harbors accelerated a brutal reassessment of Germany's war aims. By July 1944, discussions at the highest levels shifted from defeating the invasion to merely containing it long enough to deploy still developing wonder weapons or negotiate some form of separate peace. The harbors had made clear that conventional military victory against the Western Allies was no longer possible. The psychological transformation among German troops was evident in changing patterns of resistance. Allied intelligence noted that by early July, German units were displaying markedly different behaviors depending on whether they faced British, Canadian, or American forces. Units opposing the British and Canadians continued to fight with determination, particularly around Caen, where the terrain favored defense. Against American forces breaking out from the beaches, however, resistance became increasingly fragmented. Surrender rates rose dramatically, with many prisoners citing the harbors and the endless flow of supplies they enabled as factors in their decision to capitulate. Allied interrogation reports from mid-July note this trend explicitly. One report dated July 19th stated, "Prisoners from 352nd Division display notably lower morale than those captured in June." Multiple prisoners independently reference the artificial harbors as evidence the war is lost. Senior NCOs and junior officers, in particular, cite the harbors as proof of what we are truly fighting against. The harbors' impact on German strategic thinking outlasted the Normandy campaign. As Allied forces broke out from the beachhead in late July and early August, German commanders increasingly recognized they faced not just a tactical defeat, but a strategic revolution. The ability to create infrastructure at will meant defensive lines could be outflanked, supply lines extended indefinitely, and traditional geographic advantages neutralized. General Major Rudolf Christoph Freiherr von Gersdorf, Chief of Staff for the 7th Army, captured this realization in his August 5th assessment. The Allies have demonstrated the capacity to create logistics infrastructure wherever military necessity dictates. This capability renders traditional defensive thinking obsolete. No natural obstacle, not rivers, not mountains, not even the Rhine itself, can be considered secure when facing an enemy with such resources and engineering capability. Von Gersdorf's assessment proved prophetic. In March 1945, when Allied forces reached the Rhine, they brought with them bridge-building capabilities that allowed them to cross the river in multiple locations simultaneously, overwhelming German defenses that had concentrated around traditional crossing points. The engineering lessons learned from the Mulberry harbors directly informed these later operations, particularly regarding prefabrication and rapid deployment. The harbors' legacy extended far beyond their immediate military impact. For many German officers who survived the war, the harbors remained a powerful symbol of the fundamental miscalculation at the heart of Nazi strategy. Germany had initiated a conflict against nations whose combined industrial capacity vastly exceeded its own, believing superior will, discipline, and tactical skill would overcome material disadvantage. Hauptmann Franz Weber, the intelligence officer who had stood beside Oberst Richter on that June morning when they first observed the harbors, reflected on this miscalculation in his 1968 memoir. The floating harbors represented the moment when reality overwhelmed ideology. We had been taught that will triumphs over material, that spirit overcomes resources. The harbors taught us otherwise. They were physical proof that in modern industrial war, production capacity, engineering skill, and organizational capability determine outcomes more surely than elan or tactical brilliance. Weber's assessment echoed through many post-war German military analyses. The harbors had demonstrated that modern warfare was fundamentally industrial and logistical. No amount of individual heroism or tactical excellence could overcome sustained material inferiority on the scale Germany faced by 1944. For ordinary German soldiers, the harbors often represented a turning point in their personal narratives of the war. In hundreds of post-war interviews and memoirs, veterans cited their first sight of the Mulberry Harbors or their first hearing of them through comrades' reports, as moments when they recognized Germany's defeat was inevitable. Walter Fisher, the young machine gunner who had questioned his American captors about the harbors, expressed this common sentiment in a 1972 interview. "Before seeing those harbors, I believed what our leaders told us, that final victory was possible through superior will and German ingenuity. The harbors showed us the true nature of modern war. It is not decided by who has the bravest soldiers or the most determined leaders, but by who can build harbors where no harbors existed, who can produce more tanks, more planes, more of everything. Against such capacity, what chance did we have?" This recognition fundamentally altered how many German veterans understood their wartime experience. Rather than a noble struggle undone by betrayal or misfortune, narratives that had sustained German military tradition after the First World War, the harbors helped create a recognition that the conflict had been unwinnable from its inception. Germany had initiated a war of attrition against opponents whose combined industrial capacity ensured they could absorb and replace losses indefinitely. The harbors also influenced post-war reconstruction and international relations. Many German engineers and planners who witnessed the Mulberry Harbors firsthand became key figures in Germany's economic recovery, bringing with them a profound respect for Allied technical capabilities and organizational systems. Heinz Wagner, who had prepared the technical assessment of the harbors for the 352nd Division, became a leading civil engineer in post-war West Germany. In a 1965 speech to engineering students in Hamburg, he explicitly cited the harbors as an influence. "What impressed me most was not just the engineering achievement, but the organizational capability that made it possible. Different components built in different locations by different teams, all coming together perfectly in hostile conditions. This integration of design, production, and deployment is the model we must follow for Germany's reconstruction." Wagner's perspective was shared by many others who carried the lessons of the harbors into Germany's economic miracle. The recognition that industrial capacity and organizational capability, rather than abstract national character or will, determined outcomes in the modern world, profoundly influenced West German development. For military planners in post-war NATO, the harbors provided important lessons about logistics and infrastructure. The ability to rapidly deploy and build critical facilities became a central element of NATO defensive planning, particularly regarding reinforcement of Europe in the event of Soviet attack. The harbors demonstrated that geographical constraints could be overcome through technical innovation and prefabrication. The legacy of the harbors extended even to the Soviet Union, where military planners studied the Mulberry concept intensively. Soviet analyses recognized that the harbors represented not just an engineering achievement, but a strategic innovation that had helped determine the war's outcome. This recognition influenced Soviet development of mobile bridging equipment and prefabricated military infrastructure. 70 years after their brief operational life, the Mulberry Harbors remain powerful symbols of how industrial capacity shapes military outcomes. Remnants of the harbors are still visible off the Normandy coast at Arromanches, concrete monuments to the scale of Allied engineering achievement. For the German defenders who witnessed them in June 1944, the harbors represented a turning point in understanding the true nature of the conflict they had entered. In those massive concrete caissons and floating roadways, they saw not just an engineering solution to a tactical problem, but physical proof of a strategic miscalculation that would cost their nation the war. As Wilhelm Richter, the officer who first spotted the harbors from the cliffs near Arromanches, wrote in his final unpublished memoir, "The harbors taught us what we were truly fighting against, not just armies or nations, but the combined industrial might of the modern world. In those floating harbors, I saw the future of warfare and understood that Germany's path had led to inevitable defeat. Some lessons come too late to change course, but perhaps not too late to inform what follows. The legacy of that realization, that industrial capacity, technological innovation, and organizational capability determine modern conflicts more surely than will or fighting spirit, continues to influence military and strategic thinking to this day. The floating harbors of Normandy stand as concrete testimony to this enduring truth.